you an executive working to build a resilient culture that empowers the people of your organization to thrive in business and life? This podcast is for you. 7-7 Impact uses our 7-pillar framework focused on humanizing leadership to fight against a 30-year battle of unengaged employees so that organizations can create a culture of engagement, increased revenues, and consistent opportunities.
Organizations spend over $100 billion annually to improve employee engagement. Yet according to the State of the Global Workplace, only 15% of employees are engaged globally. And disengaged employees cost U.S. companies $450 to $550 billion a year in lost productivity. Today, we're talking about how to bring that employee centricity back into your culture to break through the barriers that just get in the way. So we're going to be diving into our 7-pillar framework, focusing on the core values aspect. And we know you're going to love this episode, so we're going to jump right in. I'm Lindsay Ellis with my co-founder here, Scott Cutlin, and I'm going to ask Scott, what is core values?
Hey, Lindsay. Yeah, super exciting to be here. The topic of core values is so important and so amazing, not only in a corporate or organizational environment, but for ourselves. And so when I hear the question, what is core values? That starts with me. And what I mean by that is having a starting point of understanding what specifically are Scott Cutlin's core values, what that means, where they come from, and how am I going to choose to live every day within those core values. So that's the starting point. And Lindsay, as we've had it in several conversations, if we look at these core values from our perspective, not out of some book or some perceived idea of what our core values should be, it brings up the question of what are our core values. So that's a bit of a high-level overview of what I believe core values come from or what they are. Lindsay, can you jump in to what your core values are?
Right off the bat, asking me what my core values are. I love it. Absolutely. My personal core values are faith, family, creativity, authenticity, and openness. Those are my foundations, but bringing it back to like what core values are and how they are different to everybody. Organizations are made up of people, right? And each person is made uniquely. And we all have certain things that mean the world to us, keep our foundation strong. And that's exactly where our core values come into play. So a definition would probably be something like a foundation which a person or a company uses to dictate their actions. And they are the center beliefs that are most essential to them. Without them, they would feel lost, empty, or broken. So when you put it in that perspective, I created my own core values that way because I know without those things that I just listed, I would feel lost, empty, or broken. And those things do drive my daily actions. How about you, Scott? What are your core values?
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. My core values are awareness, purpose, impact, relationship, and seek or curiosity. And so with looking at those core values, I kind of go back to something you mentioned of using those core values to dictate our decisions and how that works within the corporate environment. So there's a personal approach to this. You mentioned that companies are made of people. And so if we're tying in, if an organization is operating where the people of the company understand and know their core values, then their decisions are going to be dictated based on those decisions, right?
Yeah, totally. I think it's kind of like that unique layer that creates diversity, always creates strength. When everybody is coming from a different background, you become stronger. When somebody can be empowered to be able to live their own core values and be respected for their core values, they're not having to switch who they are when they come into the workplace, which is kind of like the definition of employee engagement, right? Like employees have the choice to bring however much of themselves to work as they want. And we know that employees that are engaged feel valued, they feel part of the culture, and they feel part of the meaning of the business. And so businesses and organizations, it's important for them to have their own core values and live and breathe those core values and let it lead through the company. So for instance, when you're interviewing an employee, you want to ask them, how do you feel about our core values? What do you know what our company core values are? And make sure that before they move forward in that interviewing process, those values are aligned with them, even if it's not their own personal values, but they're willing to adopt the values of the company in addition to the values that they're already working with. Right now, the issue is that some companies don't even let that core value, they're not even widely used throughout the corporation. But then if people don't know their own core values either, they have no idea what their direction are. They don't have a GPS system. Their actions can vary day to day. And so that's why core values becomes that strong foundation in which drives the action. I always call it the GPS of our daily decisions.
So looking at that, if we're looking at those core values and the framework and the GPS, right? And the pulse of that company, how can an organization move the needle in that engagement? Like you said, 33% of companies have the engagement, but this money is spent, but the line has been flat over the last 30 years, meaning there's been no global improvement across all companies and organizations. So companies know it's an issue. We're spending money on this problem, and to really have a solution that's going to move that needle or see an improvement in the level of engagement throughout the entire organization, how does that GPS help? And are there programs that can be implemented to be successful, to start seeing some changes?
The $100 billion that are being spent on employee engagement, it's not saying, hey, those engagements or programs are not worthwhile. They could be very beneficial programs, but the question is how much of that stuff is being implemented as soon as they leave that program, as soon as they leave that workshop. And so that's where we come in, and core values really does come in, because if you can, instead of just writing your core values down on a piece of paper and throwing it into your notebook and walk on your merry way, then it really becomes deeper than that. And so when people actually are able to make their daily decisions based on what is most important to them, then they feel full. They feel like their best self. They feel empowered. And when you have an empowered employee, that employee wants to be part of your cause. That employee wants to be part of your purpose. That employee is an employee of, it's Joe of, instead of Joe that works at. Right. And that's what we're looking at when it becomes employee engagement and creating an employee centricity culture. It is letting these people become them full selves and be able to be them full selves at work and be part of the organizational process. And that's where it starts. Core values is a huge part of my story, a huge part of my research process. But I believe that it's a foundation. It's a foundation. You cannot put sheetrock up until you have the foundation of a house. So that's where I think the core values are that foundation before you put the other layers on.
That's awesome. I heard a couple things, really. I mean, we're talking about it's a foundational approach. So we can't build on top of a shaky foundation or foundation that's been compromised. If we approach this topic of core values with strong foundation, is we have to tear it back, maybe like a remodel project, right? Like this potentially beautiful home or building sitting, but we know it has foundation problems, is we can put all of the perfect material into it, but it's still going to have a weak foundation. So we got to peel back those layers, get back to the foundation. And what we're saying is when there's alignment between a company and the people of the company via the core values, now we can work on empowerment of the people individually so they can be their best self, bring it to work. And now the companies and organizations are working together to meet all these other criteria, whether it's revenues, customer engagement, all these other things, but bringing it back to that foundational level to get aligned, encourage each other to be their best. And it's at this point we can now work together for company goals.
Yes, couldn't have said it better myself. And the impact of employee engagement showed in business success was simply the difference between success and survival. So it is important to merge those two, the people of the organization and their own core values, but then also on top of that, having the core values within the organization. This can be a scary thing, right? There's vulnerability there, and we're always, feel like maybe this should be important or that should be important, but getting down to the root of it, what's important to you is what is important to you. And there should be no should, or I think this is it. It's got to be coming straight from the core of who we are and what really does drive us. And when we can get raw like that, then change and impact happens.
Yeah, agreed. And I believe it comes down to this money that has been spent. This $1 billion in the US has been Band-Aid approached, right? I mean, we're talking about legacy
Absolutely.
Programming, fully understanding who we are, knowing where we came from, and how to apply that every single day. Again, being back in work. I mean, how many of us have sat in a work environment, a professional environment, and you see somebody not being productive or not energized or not being encouraged or not being fulfilled? And what we're saying is, when we're aligned and we're working together, the thing is, life is always going to happen, right? But we're providing an opportunity to have a conversation around that with a driving force of the company vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you said that, because nobody's saying here that if you have your core values in place, then adversity won't happen. Adversity is inevitable. Things are going to happen. Things are going to get hard. They're going to be tough. And there's going to be a lot of successes along the way too. But when you have a foundation of core values, then and let those drive your actions, then you can begin to respond versus react in those moments of adversity. And they will help you build resilience and pull through them faster with the least amount of turmoil possible. So that's why core values is such a huge part of success and employee engagement.
That's great. That makes me think about some of the conversations we've had, Lindsay, about that decision-making process, right? When we know our core values, the action step is to make decisions with those core values at the front. And so we often talk about negotiating our core values for our decisions, right? And what that means. So let's talk a little about how we live in our core values every single day, how we choose to make decisions based on our core values, and what that means for our company.
With that, I'll probably just go into like a personal story of mine to help paint the picture very clearly. Back in 2013, I pretty much changed my life, with my why being my son. Like, I really just wanted to be a leader of example with him. And as time went on, I kind of got really comfortable in that space. I was living confidently. Like, it was the best feeling I'd ever had. And in 2016, my life came crumbling down. And I remember like kind of throwing my hands up and being like, oh my gosh, I've done all this work. Is this it? What's going on? Well, I happened to pull out my core values out of a binder when I went to a core values workshop, and I had my list of core values written down. And I just remember like jaw dropping, it was that moment where I realized I was negotiating my daily actions every single day. I was negotiating my core values every single day for my daily actions. And I realized that I needed to make a change. And so I put myself into a position where I needed to get very familiar with my core values, what they were, what they meant to me, what it looked like to live them, what it looked like to live without them. And then I slowly started to try to like let those guide my decisions. And at first it was incredibly hard and scary because, okay, family, for instance, is a core value of mine. It means something so much to me. And just an example, I would take my son to bed 7:30 every single night. And that was like our time that we would spend together. And if a call would come in for work or a text would come in for work, I would find myself being like, okay, I'll be up in just a minute. Okay, let me just take this, or let me take this call real quick and I'll be up there. And then I would miss his bedtime routine, or he'd go to bed extra late. And then I'd find myself slowly building resentment against my work. I'd feel regret against not spending that time with him. And that resentment and regret, shame, all those things that does not produce a really engaged employee. That does not produce, productivity. So I was actually nervous when I started to implement, some of my core values. I was worried that my work might think that I was not interested anymore, that, maybe my customers would feel like I didn't care. Would I lose friends? All these things were popping into my head. And actually, when I started to implement them, it made me realize that, okay, my call would come in during bedtime and I would make a choice. Do I go spend the 15 minutes with my son to put him to bed and then come back and answer this call, or see if this is something that I needed to address immediately tonight, or if I could work on it first thing in the morning, or do I take the call? And it was just a simple choice. And when you put it perspective like that, it was like, okay, is it an emergency? Likely not. Would I know if it was an emergency? Probably so. Are emergencies happening every day? Not in my world, they weren't. So it allowed me to step away, spend that time with my son, fill my own cup, fill his cup, and then come back and address whatever I needed to address. And it was life-changing, and starting to implement that every single day, not just with that, but that's a way that I use core values to help guide my decisions, family being number one, helping me lead a life free from resentment and regret. That's the goal here. And when I can lead life without resentment and regret, I can lead a life of productivity, engagement, of excitement, of passion. And that in itself is a huge change. So after a year of doing that, I kind of checked back in with myself and asked myself, okay, well, what's changed? Well, in that year, I established a whole new relationship with my son. I actually took vacation for the first time in a long time. I met my now husband. I became a good co-parent with my ex-husband. I saved over $100,000, and I had the most successful business year of my corporate career. So it turned out pretty well for me.
That's so amazing, Lindsay. I mean, thank you for sharing. A couple things that really stuck in what you mentioned was when we know what our core values are, but then looking at it from a perspective of what does it look like if I live with these or live without. And so to me, that's a huge action step, right? I'm personally in a little bit different place. I recognize the core values, and it's a daily action for myself to understand what these core values are. And I'm working through how to make these decisions, right? With the, what does it look like with this decision this way or this way? I just love that perspective, because at the end of the day, we have a choice no matter what we do. Our first choice is to choose to deep dive in who we are, what our core values are, because we'll all have different ones, going through the exercises and the time and not rushing it, right? Not that Band-Aid approach to the, let's just slap integrity onto the corporate core values or the Scott Cutland core values. Because that used to be one of my quote unquote core values. And now it's nowhere near, because I took the time to deep dive into who I really am and what is really important to me. And then that really leads into the point of, if we choose to not make decisions with the core values at the front, there are those things, as you mentioned, resentment, regret, shame. But yet, when we choose to make those decisions based on the core values of who we are and how we choose to live, even though it may seem difficult or challenging in the moment, there's all these positives. There's the joy, the happiness, but it most certainly will be challenging. And it's definitely not the path of least resistance, but it's a night and day response from that decision-making process.
I just want to say real quickly too, like what you said is so true. And nobody said the journey was easy, especially like if you're operating from somebody that, doesn't even really know your core values. Or you could be like me, where I wrote down my core values, shoved them in a book, and led my daily life, and didn't even look at them again. And until I realized I said these were important to me, but I'm not really acting like they're important to me. So it could be a million different scenarios going on here. But at the end of the day, when you are full, and that's the beauty of being an individual, is like what fills you, what energizes you. That is where you become impactful. When you're drained, you're not that impactful. And so I think that that's where core values comes into play, not only for individuals of the corporations, but also for corporations. If everybody is operating off of the same corporate core values, there's no question on whether there's integrity there. There's no question on whether, there's bad decisions there, because everybody is operating within those in mind. And it helps make sure that reputation stays consistent.
Yeah, wow. There's a couple bullet points that I just took away from what you're mentioning that I think should be very heavy for everybody and every company. And so number one is, if we're not making those decisions in core values, we're not full, and that does not yield a full impact. So even the most successful company on paper, their revenues may be up, their shareholders are pleased, all these positive things, they are not at full impact. So how much are you leaving on the table, and at what cost?
Harder are you working than you work?
The other thing that was said is we're not acting like it's important to us. If we do the core values exercise, shove that in the corner of our desk, wherever it may end up, we're not acting like it, right? And so what we're saying is when a company and the face of the company know who they are and who they want to be, and then we drive that through the organization, there's a potential for full impact. And so, Lindsay, why don't you jump into a couple of the easy items of how a company can identify core values and how they can carry that through their people?
There's a couple of values that a lot of corporations use, like innovation, that's one, or people is a big one. Integrity is another big one. But at the end of the day, when the executive team is putting together, okay, how do we want our company to be known? How do we want our company to act or conduct themselves? What do we want to actually show people that we are driving towards? It's not a mission or a vision. It's the way that we show up. If executives see their core values, the best way to do it is lead by example, and making sure that they're bringing those core values up to every meeting. It's plastered everywhere. This is how we're going to show this. This is how we're going to show that. This initiative is based on this value. But not only making sure that it's on the headlines of everything that they're doing in initiatives so their company understands, their employees understand, but making sure it's bleeding down a special middle management all the way down to the employees. Because if it stops somewhere in the middle, then it's not as effective. There has to be places where, and I would say even down to the employee level, like I mentioned before, would be when you're interviewing, when you're doing the 360s, when you're doing, for that matter, team building workshops, team environment, BOAs, national sales meetings, all these things. It's bringing in those core values, and it's making sure that the employees that are working for you are just as bought into those values as you are. And the best way to do that is by letting it bleed through each layer of the organization. With every initiative you do, tapping into why you're doing it and what core values it is leading by.
The top-down approach is critically important. And again, not just plastering those words on the walls, because I've been in plenty of companies where they have their walls full of words, but inherently there's a difference when we believe it, we know it, and we take the actions in it. That's where things start changing. As Lindsay mentioned, it does start in that interview process. If we start hiring people who know who they are and understand who the company is, it's okay not to be a good fit. It's okay. You can go somewhere where you're a good fit. But oftentimes, companies, especially now, are force-feeding hires into a culture and an environment that's not conducive to have full impact or increased opportunity. When we believe it and we encourage it and embrace it, there is a complete opportunity to have a force multiplier in whatever other segment that you're in. and how to do that. And that also not only carries over in the work environment, but it's in the family environment and the friends environment and the local community environment. What we're saying, if our tanks are full and we can do a role or requisition that we love, and we're doing that for an organization that knows who they are, and there's loyalty and they respect each other. Because the fact is people are all made differently. We're all going to have different core values. But if we're aligned, we can work together as a true team to facilitate our vision or our purpose of why we even have a company, or whether that impact is locally in our small community or if it's on a global level.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, what you said, about the top-down approach, I was blown away because the core values that bled through that company, I heard them every single day. I knew exactly what they were. And I'll never forget, being at a national sales meeting. I was fairly new to the company. It was under a year that I was there, and I was at a national sales meeting, and we were all down, where we were all gathering for appetizers and stuff like that. And the CEO came down and was shaking all of our hands, just walking up to us and just being like, "I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here." And walking through, shaking our hands. And I just remember feeling so appreciated. I remember feeling valued and I was part of something. This CEO is coming down and shaking my hand and making me part of the people of this company. And it just made me want to work so much harder, and it made me believe. And at that point in time, I didn't know my own core values, but I knew theirs, and I became part of something. And then that company actually had employee initiatives to where we each got to go to workshops and learn our own core values, and then have team building workshops, which is the same thing that we can actually provide with that, because it's such a great way to let the organization's core values just shine through everybody and bleed through the entire corporation from top to bottom, and then giving those employees the space to find their own, and then have a team building workshop on how everybody's might be different, and kind of sharing what they are, what they mean to them, and then actually making that part of the team culture as well. It helps us with compassion. It helps us with vulnerability. It helps us with respect, and relate to each other in a whole different way, and understand each other in a whole different way, which allows for everybody in the team to be full and to be heard.
That was a very visual explanation. You could literally see the CEO coming up, and I'm hearing some of the follow-up strategies. And oftentimes we hear the water cooler talk of, oh, so-and-so is drinking the Kool-Aid, right? And I think what we're talking about here is a very large bridge from drinking the Kool-Aid to having that space to be ourselves and aligned with an organization that knows who they are and is leading team to execute on what people's passions may be, or just a place they should be. Those are the differentiators. Having a CEO that can come down and shake hands and engage in conversation, and then being a person of the organization to see the follow-up and the action taking place, and not just these Band-Aid approaches to feed a report, to have data saying we're a company with engaged employees. Because at the end of the day, those reports don't really dictate if somebody believes they are part of something bigger and better, feel that loyalty and appreciate the CEO shaking the hand, or are they just going to churn and say, yep, there's so-and-so's doing it again.
Exactly. And, talking about that too, it's important to mention that, there are a lot of CEOs that end up leaving companies, and new CEOs come on board. When those core values are not changed based on the CEO that comes on board, or that CEO does not believe in those same values and does nothing with them, a culture of a company can shift very quickly, which in this case is what happened with that company that I was working with, right? So slowly but surely, we started to hear less and less about the core values. Less and less, it was not coming through the organization. Our initiatives weren't around it. And so there was a huge shift in the culture, which is why I always go back to that feeling of experience of being a brand new employee there, but gave everything I had because of the way that I felt. I felt part of something. And so when CEO or executive teams do change up a little bit, then it's important for those new executives to come in and make sure that they are either buying into those values and letting them come through the company or changing them up. It's okay to change your core values if the vision of the company is going a different way. It's okay to do that. But it has to be true to what the organization stands for. And I think that's important to make sure I mention.
Yeah, so great. I think that's a good part to kind of come out on is, as an executive team, we have the opportunity, we have the choice to engage with the people the way we set forth and allow people to have the space to be them best selves at work and provide an opportunity of culture where there is loyalty and people want to give the most that they have. And so that's where 7-7 Impact has this framework that has 7 pillars, and core values is the second pillar. And this is a way to help move the needle, to get away from that flat line of the lack of engagement in the day we live in today. You know, right now, it's the great resignation. People are living for money. People are leaving to find a more loyal company. People are leaving for all sorts of reasons. But when we work with clients and our customers, what we're hearing is that if people are in with a company that they feel recognized, that they feel like they're valued, that feel like they have an opportunity to execute on what they choose in their role the best they can, there's all these reasons to stay at a company. And we know attrition is at an all-time high. This approach works. And it's not as complex as a lot of people would think. It's about the taking action and encouraging one another and choosing to make the decisions within the core values and not negotiating those core values at the decision-making process.
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been great. I've really enjoyed talking. You know, I love talking about core values. Before we close up, I want to ask you, you have a personal story around how core values has impacted you.
Lindsay, I always have personal stories. So, you know, that the first story that comes to mind is, some of you may know, I've spent quite a few times and days and months in pretty crazy places in the world, in mountaineering and alpining and climbing and hiking. And there is a lot of variables that are consistently changing. So if we approach every single day the same, we're really setting ourselves up for failures. I have this linear thought process of every single day, I really have to die to what I think or what I thought of yesterday, but take today for what it is and those variables that are thrown into the equation. So every morning, I have to kind of push everything I've known aside and evaluate for what we are in today. And I look at that synonymous with core values, because if I'm making those decisions for the day based on one of my favorite core values, awareness, we could talk a lot about that. If I choose not to be aware of my situation, of myself, of the people around me, of what culture I'm in, what country I'm in, or maybe even the tensions in that country or time, the outcomes will be very, very different. And so, yeah, I kind of look at that as death and dying to the old every single day and taking the opportunity to choose to look at these values every single day and move forward and strive, just like in mountaineering, whether it's the right equipment, the time to move, the time to eat, the time to stay still. There's lots of choices to be made. And if we don't make the right choices or choose to make the best choices at the right time, there are consequences. And just as we talked about earlier, that may be full of regret and shame, or fill our buckets with joy and happiness and make it to that summit.
I love it. Thank you. That was good. As you can see, our stories are so incredibly different, but the one thing that aligns with them is the ability to make a choice based on what's most important to us to keep us full and free from that resentment and the regret. And so we just want to challenge our listeners to ask yourself, what are your core values? What are your company core values? How are you letting them drive your actions every day? Or are you negotiating your values every day for your actions? It's a great time to step back and just think about that, reflect on that, and decide today to make a choice in line with your core values.
Thank you so much again. This is C-Suite 7, Lindsay Ellis and Scott Cutland. We really appreciate the time.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.